Eric's day started off like any other: rushed coffee, a quick nod at his neighbor, and a hasty drive to the office. He'd been dragging himself through months of monotony, convinced he could bury the past if he stayed busy enough. But fate's a funny thing. That afternoon, he decided to take a walk through the old park just to clear his head. He didn't plan on seeing anyone he knew, much less Amelia. Yet there she was, seated on a chipped green bench like she'd never left. Their eyes locked, and his heart practically stopped. He'd spent so long pretending she was just a painful memory, but now she was flesh and blood, right in front of him. The wind seemed to hold its breath as he stood there, grappling with the anger, the sorrow, and the flood of what used to be. A million questions swirled in his mind. Why was she here? Did she come looking for him? Was this some cruel joke? He took a shaky step forward and she looked up. One glance told him she was carrying her own burden of hurt. In that split second, the distance between them felt greater than it ever had, even though only a few feet of cracked pavement separated them. Memories of late-night talks and whispered promises flashed through his mind, along with the gut-wrenching moment he thought she betrayed him. For months, he'd told himself he was over it, that maybe he'd overreacted or that he just needed more time. But seeing her now made him realize he never truly moved on. In that moment, her face pale, his heart pounding, they both knew their shared history wasn't done. And it sure looked like they were about to revisit every painful piece of it, whether they wanted to or not. Later that night, Eric couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, mind racing back to one specific memory: an evening soaked in rain. He was 19 then, fired up by dreams of building a life with Amelia. She was fearless back in those days, always pushing him out of his comfort zone. On that stormy night, he remembered her waiting by his dorm building, completely drenched but grinning from ear to ear. She didn't care about the thunder booming overhead or the water sloshing around her feet. She only cared about making the most of every second, no matter how crazy it seemed. That was the night he gave her his old sweater, the one with frayed cuffs and a faded band logo. It was his favorite, something he wore practically every day, and passing it on felt like a statement of trust. When she slipped it on, it was almost like they sealed a promise to always be there for each other, come storm or sunshine. Even now, he could practically smell the wet wool, hear her laughter echoing through the raindrops, and feel that wild, young spark that told him he'd do just about anything for her. But life has a twisted sense of humor. All those forevers they whispered under the pouring sky turned to dust. His mind flitted to the day he found evidence, pictures, texts, rumors swirling, confirming she'd done something he couldn't forgive. He'd felt like an idiot handing over that precious sweater to someone who'd used him. Yet, lying in bed this particular evening, rain pattering on his window, the memory of her smile reminded him of how real those moments once were. It also reminded him that the truth might be more complicated than he ever let himself believe. Eric woke up with clenched fists and a heavy chest. Reliving the dark day, he hurled accusations at Amelia. He recalled the way her face crumpled as he waved around those damning photos and text messages, claiming she'd betrayed him with someone else. At the time, he believed every scandalous rumor because the so-called proof fit too well with the worst-case scenario swirling in his head. He was raw from their recent arguments, and doubts about her loyalty had been festering. That night, in a cramped apartment filled with half-packed boxes and half-finished apologies, he confronted her in a rage he never knew he had. He remembered how she tried to speak, how her voice trembled as she insisted there was more to the story. But he was too far gone, too bent on punishing her for what he believed she'd done. He hurled cruel words, demanded she leave, and shut the door on the one person he claimed to have loved with all his heart. Now, looking back, he saw the holes in his logic. He'd never actually given her a fair chance to explain. Instead, he let suspicion and pride paint her as the villain in every scenario. It was like a twisted game he was determined to win, even if it meant they'd both lose. Now, after all this time, the memory was so vivid it almost made him nauseous. Standing in that park, seeing her hunched figure on the bench, he realized he never truly healed because he never learned the full story. He'd only told himself he was the victim, ignoring the possibility that someone else might have been pulling the strings. As the day stretched out, Eric felt a spark of determination growing. He needed answers, and this time he'd listen. Later that evening, Eric walked through the cool, dimly lit park again, mind spinning. Amelia was there, pacing by the fountain, tear-streaked face reflecting on the water's surface. He approached slowly, unsure if she even wanted to talk. When she spotted him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and dread. Without much of a greeting, she dove into a confession that left him stunned. She talked about the photos and messages he'd thrown in her face that fateful night. She said they were manipulated, altered to create a narrative that wasn't true. At first, he felt a wave of anger, like she was just making excuses. But she showed him something on her phone, bits of saved correspondence that hinted at a web of lies he'd never considered. Her tears weren't for show. They were raw and genuine, laced with heartbreak and fear. She admitted she hadn't fought hard enough to prove her innocence back then. She let pride and pain drive her away when he refused to trust her. As she spoke, he sensed the depth of her desperation, the loneliness she felt when all their friends believed she was guilty. She admitted she hadn't been perfect, she'd kept secrets, but not the ones he thought. Her real secret was how vulnerable and insecure she felt, how easily manipulated she'd been by someone who thrived on planting suspicion in Eric's mind. By the time she finished, Eric was left with more questions than answers. Who would go to such lengths to tear them apart? And why? Amelia's apology hung in the air, heavy and charged with regret. For a moment, he remembered the fearless girl who once stood in the pouring rain, wearing his old sweater like a badge of honor. He realized that somewhere under the layers of pain, that same brave heart was still beating. In the days that followed, Eric felt like he was living two lives, the usual drudgery of work, grocery shopping, and small talk with neighbors, and a secret mission to figure out who had twisted his relationship into knots. He couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that someone had been orchestrating every misunderstanding between him and Amelia. It wasn't enough to just accept her confession. He needed to know who'd fed him that so-called evidence. Even more confusing was realizing how easily he'd swallowed it all, especially since he'd once trusted Amelia more than anyone. As he tried to piece things together, he stumbled on small clues, a whispered conversation from a mutual friend, an offhand remark that someone had cash to burn, and a few suspicious side-eyes whenever her name came up. It felt like a puzzle with pieces scattered across places he thought he knew, revealing a manipulative force lurking behind the scenes. He called Amelia to discuss what he'd found, and for the first time in a long while, they were on the same side of a problem. She seemed shaken but determined. They talked about people they both knew, jealous exes, coworkers with grudges, even random acquaintances who might have had a twisted motive. The more they speculated, the more Eric realized how naive he'd been, how he'd let pride and bitterness cloud his judgment. While no clear suspect emerged just yet, the hints pointed to someone close enough to know their weaknesses. And whoever it was had turned those weaknesses into weapons. Eric didn't know what confronted him more, the pain of losing Amelia all that time under false pretenses, or the uncomfortable truth that he'd allowed a stranger's manipulations to destroy something real. One thing was certain, they were no longer alone in this nightmare, they had an enemy in the shadows, and that enemy was still out there. Determined to track down the mastermind who tore them apart, Eric began a deep dive into his past. It wasn't exactly a feel-good exercise. Revisiting old places meant dredging up painful memories, but he knew it was the only way forward. He started with the bar where he first heard the gossip about Amelia. The bartender recognized him and gave a tight-lipped smile, recalling the night Eric stormed out. Eric asked about the people he'd seen there, pressing gently until a few useful details came to light. He visited the building where Amelia used to work as an intern. In the hallway, the scuffed floors and humming fluorescent lights took him back to the days he dropped by with coffee in hand. People who remembered him offered sympathetic smiles but had little information to share. Still, every nod and shrug told him there was more beneath the surface, something bigger than just petty office drama. Deep down, Eric blamed himself for never double-checking the accusations when they first appeared. He realized he'd been so busy nursing his bruised ego that he never asked the right questions. As he continued his search, he noticed how quick he'd been to throw Amelia under the bus, how he'd let rumor and speculation become facts in his head. Late at night, he'd lie awake in bed replaying scenarios, spotting the red flags he should have caught back then. He couldn't stop the tide of guilt that washed over him. But guilt alone wasn't enough. He had to act. So, with every new clue, like a suspicious phone call from an unlisted number or a mention of someone planting stories, he felt a new surge of determination. He promised himself that he'd figure out who set this in motion and maybe, just maybe, find some redemption along the way. Sitting in his old room, now filled with boxes of childhood souvenirs, Eric couldn't help but reflect on the kind of person he'd been. His pride, he realized, was a monster all on its own. He'd always been the kind of guy who had to be right, who believed his instincts were ironclad. Back then, if anyone suggested he might have misread a situation, he'd snap back or shut down. It was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting himself from vulnerability. But in doing so, he'd locked out people who genuinely cared. The more he mulled it over, the more he remembered tiny moments he brushed off at the time, how Amelia would try to calm him down with gentle reminders, hey, maybe hear them out, or could there be another explanation? But he'd blow up, insisting he knew better. That attitude had cost him dearly. Sure, he'd read the texts that seemed to show she was unfaithful, and he'd seen pictures that told a damning story. But looking back, the entire setup felt too on the nose, too perfect. His pride, though, craved a scapegoat. It was easier to pin the blame on Amelia than to admit he might have been wrong. Now, after stumbling onto signs that all of it was orchestrated, he wondered if he'd ever truly believed she was a cheater. Maybe part of him always suspected there was more to it. Recalling the nights he'd lie awake, half hoping she'd prove him wrong, he realized how his ego clung to the idea that being betrayed was less embarrassing than admitting he'd messed up. As he rummaged through old photo albums and half-written letters, he faced an uncomfortable truth. If he'd just let down his guard and listened, they might have stood a chance. That realization hurt like nothing else, showing him that the cost of pride is often paid in heartbreak. Amelia and Eric found themselves back in old haunts, places that once held simple, joyful memories, but now seemed haunted by betrayal. One afternoon, they bumped into a mutual friend at the coffee shop where they used to study. The friend's eyes darted nervously when they asked about rumors from the past, offering half-baked answers and quickly changing the subject. Later, they swung by the small art studio where Amelia once volunteered. An old acquaintance recognized her and gave a guarded greeting. Something in her expression said she knew more than she was letting on. A few sly comments hinted that someone had shown up back then, waving proof to feed the gossip mill. Eric felt the hair on his neck stand up. This matched the timeline of their breakup almost exactly. Then there was the brief but awkward run-in with Amelia's former coworker. He seemed friendly at first, but the second they probed about any fishy events or suspicious people, he locked up. His hands fidgeted, glancing around like someone might be watching. Eric caught that subtle hint of fear. It was clear that multiple people from their past had seen or heard something, but few were willing to speak openly. Frustrated, Amelia and Eric left each conversation with only scraps of information that mostly confirmed what they already suspected. Some outside player had been stirring the pot, ensuring the worst possible narrative reached Eric's ears. Each encounter chipped away at the anger Eric once harbored toward Amelia. Now he was angry at himself for being so easily duped and angry at whoever set this in motion. But most of all, he felt a simmering determination. If everyone was so spooked, that meant the real puppeteer still had influence. They just needed to find the right thread to pull, the right question to ask, to bring it all to light. At first, working side by side felt surreal. Eric and Amelia had once shared everything, from late-night pizza cravings to daydreams about the future. But now they had to team up under the worst possible circumstances, trying to unravel a mystery that stole their trust. Neither of them was fully comfortable with the arrangement. Old resentments still hovered, and conversations veered into tense silences or awkward small talk. But they also knew they didn't have much choice. Two sets of eyes and ears were better than one, especially since they suspected they were being watched. They decided on a strategy. Amelia would check in with her old contacts who might open up to her because of shared experiences, while Eric would approach his circle of friends, searching for that one hint or lead that could break the case wide open. The arrangement forced them to communicate regularly, trading updates on what they learned. Sometimes they'd meet in public places, a diner on the edge of town, or the park in broad daylight, both cautious about being overheard. There were moments when they almost let their guard down, like when they found themselves laughing at an old inside joke, quickly remembering the weight that still hung between them. Late at night, Eric found himself thinking about the what-ifs. What if they'd had better communication back then? Would any of this have happened if they'd trusted each other more? He sensed Amelia might be wrestling with the same questions because, in those fleeting moments when she looked at him, he caught a glimpse of regret in her eyes. The alliance wasn't easy. Resentment doesn't vanish just because you want answers. But as days passed and more puzzle pieces fell into place, they both started to see that working together was the only shot they had at healing old wounds and finding the truth. Eric felt a chill creep up his spine whenever he sensed it, the feeling they weren't alone. Sometimes he'd catch a figure in the corner of his eye when he parked the car at night, only to find no one there when he turned around. Other times, Amelia would text him saying she swore she saw someone ducking behind a row of hedges outside her apartment. It got worse when, on 2 separate occasions, they received anonymous notes slipped under their doors. They weren't threatening notes, exactly, more like ominous reminders that someone was keeping tabs on them. The messages were handwritten, a few cryptic lines telling them not to stir up trouble or dig too deep. That told Eric they were definitely on the right track. Fear was a new player in his life. He'd never considered himself easily spooked, but knowing they were being watched twisted his nerves into knots. He'd glance over his shoulder wherever he went, buying groceries, filling up gas, or just jogging around the neighborhood. The worst part was that the figure in the shadows seemed to know both of their routines intimately. They weren't sloppy. Whoever it was had experience staying hidden, which only made Eric more suspicious that this was bigger than a simple personal grudge. Amelia tried to keep her composure, but Eric could see the tension eating at her. She'd snap her blinds shut with trembling hands, always checking to make sure her door was locked. "I didn't sign up for a spy movie," she'd joke weakly, but the fear in her voice was real. Each new sign that they were being tailed up the stakes of their investigation. If someone was this invested in keeping them from the truth, it meant the truth might be more explosive than they ever imagined. One late afternoon, Eric got a call from Amelia, her voice buzzing with urgency. She'd found something big, she said, while digging through old files at a local storage place she'd rented years ago. He raced over, heart pounding, unsure if it was genuine hope or just adrenaline. When he arrived, she held a dusty cardboard box filled with letters, photographs, and a small stack of printed emails. Her hands shook as she explained that she'd nearly forgotten this stuff existed. Buried under a pile of college textbooks, the box hadn't been touched since she moved out of her parents' place. They spread everything out on a makeshift table under a flickering overhead light. Carefully, they examined each item. Most were innocent mementos, silly doodles from their early days, half-finished love letters, postcards. But then they stumbled on a set of emails that didn't match the rest of the keepsakes. They were from someone Amelia thought she knew, a once-trusted friend. The tone of the emails turned Eric's stomach. They hinted at a plan to expose Amelia, referencing manipulated photos and staged encounters. Reading through them, Eric felt his pulse spike. This was the smoking gun they needed. It laid out pieces of a twisted scheme, clearly aimed at sabotaging Amelia and, by extension, their relationship. The emails also included references to a bigger network of people who seemed to have their own agendas. Amelia's eyes welled up with tears of anger and relief. For so long, she'd wanted to prove she wasn't the villain in their story. Now, they had proof that pointed to a shadowy puppet master and possibly multiple accomplices. As they snapped photos of the evidence to keep digital copies, Eric realized that this was only the tip of the iceberg. Still, these letters were a huge step toward unraveling the entire twisted plot, tangible proof that confirmed their worst suspicions and gave them a fighting chance at finally clearing the air. Armed with fresh evidence, Eric and Amelia faced a wave of conflicting emotions, relief, anger, and a strange excitement. They decided it was time to confront the people who'd once stood by and watched their relationship collapse. This took the form of tense, face-to-face conversations they jokingly dubbed the trial, though there was nothing funny about it. First, they invited a couple of mutual acquaintances to a neutral spot. Music was always too loud for anyone to eavesdrop. Eric laid out some of the emails, carefully covering names to see how they reacted. When confronted with the possibility of a third party's manipulation, their friends exchanged guilty glances. One admitted hearing rumors about photo doctoring, but fear of retaliation kept them silent. Another confessed to seeing Amelia's supposed evidence of cheating, but always thought it felt off. These half-confessions both validated their discoveries and fueled their resentment. Why hadn't anyone spoken up sooner? Next, they sought out the friend who wrote some of those incriminating emails. That encounter was anything but pleasant. The moment they revealed they knew about the forged photos, the person's face twisted into a mix of shock and defiance. Defensive excuses flew left and right, blaming a higher authority, claiming ignorance of how deep things went. Eric and Amelia pressed for names, details, anything that could give them the final piece of the puzzle. The conversation ended with raised voices, tears, and a half-hearted apology that felt more like an attempt to save face. Walking away, Amelia's emotions teetered between fury and heartbreak. She treated these people like family, only to realize they'd played a part, big or small, in ruining her reputation. Eric felt a similar sting, grappling with both the heartbreak of betrayal and the bitter relief that at least they were edging closer to unmasking whoever orchestrated all this from the start. In the middle of their investigative wins, tension flared between Eric and Amelia. Digging into all these painful memories had taken its toll. One evening, they sat down to comb through the last batch of emails, and a small, offhand remark from Eric, something about how Amelia should have spoken up sooner, sparked a heated argument. Amelia fired back that he never gave her a chance in the first place. The words spilled out in a rush, bringing old resentments to the surface. Their voices got louder, tempers boiled. In the heat of the moment, Amelia accused Eric of being too stubborn to see what was right in front of him. Eric countered that she'd shut him out and left him no choice but to believe the worst. Soon they were both drowning in what-ifs and you never listened. It was like the dam broke, and all the pent-up hurt, regret, and bitterness flooded the room. The argument felt like a twisted rerun of their worst fights, a reminder that even if they were working together now, the scars ran deep. Eventually, Eric slammed the laptop shut and stormed out for air. Amelia stayed behind, tears welling up as she realized how fragile their alliance truly was. Yes, they were close to solving the mystery, but their emotional wounds still festered. As the night wore on, Eric cooled off and returned, a bottle of water in hand, eyes cast downward. They both recognized this kind of anger was exactly what the real enemy wanted, something that could break them apart once more and keep the truth buried. With quiet apologies and tired sighs, they agreed to keep going, but it was clear their unity was hanging by a thread. The ghosts of their unresolved issues hovered, reminding them that while they might find the truth, mending a broken bond was an entirely different battle. Dawn came with a promise of a fresh start. Eric woke up determined to do better, to show Amelia through actions, rather than empty words, that he was genuinely sorry. He drove to her place with a simple plan: talk honestly and listen for once. When she opened the door, she looked tired but less guarded than the night before. He set aside pride, apologized properly, and admitted how much he regretted letting anger make decisions for him. In a moment of sincerity, he told her, "I can't fix the past, but I want to try to make things right now." It wasn't a grand statement, just a heartfelt one. Amelia took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with something between hope and hesitation. She spoke softly, telling him she, too, was sorry for not fighting harder for their relationship back then. Sometimes, she said, it hurt so much she convinced herself walking away was easier, but she was tired of running. Together, they agreed on a truce: no more yelling, no more blame games. Instead, they'd focus on finding the truth about who sabotaged them and, in the process, maybe learn to trust each other again. Eric vowed to keep an open mind, to ask questions instead of jumping to conclusions. He also admitted that he'd been carrying a lot of guilt, worried he was too late to make up for what he did. Amelia looked at him, her expression a mix of empathy and sadness, and told him, "We can't change yesterday, but we can decide what we do today." It wasn't an easy fix, but it was a start. Holding on to that fragile thread of hope, they turned back to the evidence, more committed than ever to uncovering every lie, every twisted plot, and to walking this long road to redemption. Together, one step at a time. Fueled by their renewed resolve, Eric and Amelia dove deeper into the puzzle. They spent hours mapping out clues on a corkboard, connecting names, dates, and locations with thumbtacks and bits of colored string. It looked dramatic, but it helped them see patterns they'd missed before. They noticed how certain events overlapped. A random rumor popping up right after Amelia received a glowing work review, or suspicious calls to Eric's phone right before he'd get bombarded with evidence of her supposed infidelity. Over time, a pattern emerged, pointing to a group of people who seemed to have vested interests in making sure Amelia and Eric stayed apart and distracted. Some were connected to old workplace rivalries, while others had ties to people Eric once considered close friends. Whenever they followed one lead, it branched off into another, revealing layers of deceit that extended beyond just personal grudges. It seemed like their breakup had been part of a bigger scheme, a piece of a puzzle that went well beyond just romantic drama. They discovered emails referencing business deals, hush money, and blackmail that reached into circles of influence neither had imagined. It was dizzying and a bit terrifying to think they'd been pawns in a game so large. But for every shocking reveal, they felt themselves grow closer in a weird way. Working long nights side by side, rummaging through documents, they found a familiar rhythm, like when they used to stay up cramming for finals in college, passing notes, and sharing jokes. The difference was, now their conversation was peppered with references to hidden agendas and forged evidence. Still, the camaraderie gave them strength. Step by step, they peeled back the layers of the onion, and with each peeled layer, the tears in their eyes felt closer to relief than sorrow. It wasn't just about clearing Amelia's name anymore, it was about confronting a network of manipulation that had cost them both so much. An old contact finally cracked, directing them to a murky place on the outskirts of town, a kind of underground club where backroom deals supposedly went down. Under normal circumstances, neither Eric nor Amelia would have stepped foot there. But the tip hinted that someone with direct knowledge of the scheme would be there that night, possibly ready to talk for a price. They both felt a surge of nerves as they pulled into the dimly lit parking lot. The neon sign flickered and the bass from inside pulsed through the walls. Amelia gripped Eric's arm, reminding him to stay calm, while he whispered back a promise that they'd keep each other safe. Inside, the smoke and chatter created a tense, charged atmosphere. They stuck close, scanning the crowd for the contact they were supposed to meet. Each step deeper into the place made Eric's heart pound harder. He wasn't naive, he knew this was risky. But they were desperate for answers, even if it meant venturing into the belly of the beast. After an anxious wait at a corner table, a figure approached them, a woman with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Without much preamble, she hinted she knew who was behind their downfall, mentioning a name they recognized but never suspected. Before they could press for more, she noticed someone watching and clammed up. That someone turned out to be a bouncer with a menacing glare. Sensing danger, Eric and Amelia made a swift exit, only to find that their car had been keyed, a warning scratched into the paint. It was a grim reminder that they weren't just dealing with petty rumors anymore, this was a dangerous web of secrets and lies. The brief conversation yielded a crucial clue, but it also confirmed they were in over their heads. It seemed like every time they got closer to the truth, the shadows pushed back, determined to keep everything buried. After escaping the club with shaken nerves and an etched-up car, Eric and Amelia regrouped. Their single lead pointed to someone they never imagined could be behind this chaos. But they still needed confirmation and maybe even more allies, because it was clear the stakes were higher than personal drama. They reached out to a few contacts who had once been close friends, people they thought might still have some sense of loyalty. To their surprise, a couple stepped forward, admitting they'd noticed odd behavior and hush-hush meetings involving the suspected mastermind. It felt good to know not everyone had sold them out. But with those allies came unintended friction. Some old friends who seemed supportive at first turned cagey the moment they heard the name they were investigating. A few even tried to dissuade them from digging any further, muttering about burning bridges and making enemies you can't handle. This only convinced Eric they were on the right track. The lines between friend and foe got blurrier each day. People Eric once trusted with secrets now seemed to be working against them, covering up tracks and dismissing their suspicions. On the flip side, folks they barely knew offered cryptic bits of information as if they'd seen enough shady dealings to want the truth out. The entire situation became a strange dance of phone calls, whispered meetups, and chasing leads down dead-end alleys. Through it all, Amelia and Eric had each other's backs, navigating tense conversations and uncertain alliances. They tried to protect these new confidants while keeping themselves out of harm's way. The further they went, the more they realized they weren't just fighting for their relationship. They were now entangled in something that had roped in multiple lives, livelihoods, and reputations. And somewhere behind the curtain, a single puppet master, or possibly a ring of them, was pulling the strings, banking on them never unraveling the truth. With each new puzzle piece, Eric and Amelia realized their pursuit of the truth came at a cost. Financially, they found themselves shelling out money for shady sources, quiet meetings, and even repairs for the car. Emotionally, it was even pricier. Nights were sleepless, haunted by the knowledge that each step forward put them at greater risk. They had to dodge prying eyes and watch their words, unsure who might be feeding information back to their enemy. One evening, Amelia's phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. It read, "Stop now or regret it." The threat felt real, not just empty words. She showed it to Eric, and he felt an icy dread settle in his stomach. It made them question if finding the truth was worth the fear creeping into every corner of their lives. But they pressed on, fueled by a blend of anger and a need for closure. They couldn't live with the regret of not seeing this through, especially now that it was clear multiple people had been victimized in one way or another by the puppet master's schemes. In more vulnerable moments, Eric worried about the toll this was taking on Amelia. He could see she was worn thin, battling nightmares and anxiety. But she refused to back down, reminding him that this was bigger than them. "If we give up now, we're letting whoever did this win," she'd say, voice trembling but resolute. Over time, they began to see the lines of deception run straight through business interests and personal vendettas. It wasn't just about humiliating Amelia and Eric, it was about power and control, with them caught in the crossfire. The price of the truth, they realized, was stepping into dangerous territory where powerful people played games they weren't meant to lose. Yet they couldn't turn back. The only way out was through, no matter the collateral damage it might bring. Ironically, amid all this chaos and fear, something else began to blossom, a quiet rekindling of the bond Eric and Amelia once shared. It wasn't some sweeping romantic declaration. It was subtle, small moments of empathy, gentle touches when words failed, and the shared weight of what they were going through. One night, huddled in Amelia's living room, they sifted through documents with nothing but a dim lamp lighting the space. They'd both had an exhausting day chasing down elusive sources. Out of nowhere, Eric realized Amelia had fallen asleep on the couch, head resting on a pile of notes. He carefully moved them aside, draping a blanket over her. In that moment, he felt a wave of protectiveness and remembered how much he once adored her, how he still did, really, despite everything. When Amelia stirred awake, she found him sitting on the floor beside her, eyes filled with concern. She gave him a tired smile and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't a grand confession, but it spoke volumes. As they continued their investigation, those little moments popped up more and more: stolen glances, a comforting hand on the shoulder, jokes that broke the tension at just the right time. They didn't discuss it outright, maybe too afraid to name what was happening. But the spark they'd thought was long dead flickered between them, fueled by mutual support in a dangerous situation. The old wounds were still there, no doubt about it. Misunderstandings and scars from their breakup weren't going to disappear overnight. But shared adversity has a way of testing and revealing hearts, and theirs were starting to open again, despite the grim circumstances. Sometimes Amelia would catch Eric staring at her like he used to, and for a split second all the mess faded. They may have been in the crossfire, with threats looming and secrets unraveling, but that flicker of love was undeniable, waiting for them to decide if it was worth fighting for a second time. After weeks of painstaking work, their leads finally converged on one name, someone who'd been a part of both Eric's and Amelia's lives for a long time. The betrayal cut deeper than any random acquaintance ever could. Eric felt his gut churn the moment he realized who it was. He remembered nights out drinking with this person, swapping stories and life plans, never suspecting a thing. Amelia stared at the final pieces of evidence with tears in her eyes. She whispered, "I trusted them," her voice thick with disbelief. The final puzzle piece was an incriminating series of bank transfers along with emails that laid out the puppet master's real motives. They'd orchestrated not just Eric and Amelia's downfall, but also manipulated a broader circle of people, playing them off each other for personal gain, financial, professional, and likely personal vengeance. The discovery was almost too big to process. Eric wondered if he'd missed warning signs, times when this person's advice nudged him to suspect Amelia more, or moments when they'd conveniently show up with new proof of her so-called betrayal. Now, seeing the name in black and white, everything came into focus: the manipulator's presence at key moments, their subtle push to fan the flames of distrust, their plausible excuses for being in the right places at the right times. He felt a storm of rage and heartbreak collide in his chest. Amelia sank into a chair, trembling. "All those times I thought you hated me," she said softly, looking at Eric. "They made sure of it." Eric's jaw tightened. The sting of realizing someone he considered a friend had meticulously dismantled his relationship was staggering. But there was also a grim sense of relief. Finally, they knew who had set their lives ablaze. The question was, why go through all that trouble? The next step was obvious: they had to confront this person, get answers, and expose their lies once and for all. They arranged a meeting at a quiet, out-of-the-way spot, a deserted warehouse near the edge of town. It felt dramatic, but it guaranteed no prying eyes or unsuspecting bystanders. When the betrayer arrived, their expression flickered between confusion and a feigned casualness. Eric wasted no time, throwing down the printed emails and bank receipts. Amelia stood by his side, arms folded, her gaze locked on the betrayer's face. The air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. At first, the betrayer tried to backpedal, muttering about misunderstandings and claiming they were being framed. But their voice wavered and they couldn't meet Eric's glare or Amelia's tear-streaked eyes. Slowly, piece by incriminating piece, Eric laid out the entire twisted plot, how the photos were staged, how rumors were strategically spread, and how certain folks were paid off to make the lies stick. Amelia's voice shook with anger as she demanded an explanation. She recounted the pain of being shunned by friends, losing job opportunities, and being branded a cheater by the very people she thought would stand by her. Finally, the betrayer broke. The confession spilled out in choked sobs and bitter admissions. Jealousy, greed, power, there were plenty of reasons for wanting to see Amelia and Eric fail. According to the betrayer, it started small, maybe a little rumor here, a nudge there, but success fed the hunger for more. Soon, it spun into a bigger scheme involving personal vendettas and financial gains from blackmailing others. By the end, the betrayer was on their knees, tears streaming, begging for some level of understanding or mercy. But Eric and Amelia stood shell-shocked, hearts pounding, as they realized the scale of betrayal went far beyond just breaking them up. This wasn't just about their ruined love story, this was a web of lies that had ensnared an entire circle of people. All the manipulations, heartbreak, and endless suspicion could be traced back to the single, trembling figure who now pleaded for forgiveness. The emotional aftermath of that confrontation was almost as devastating as the betrayal itself. Eric found himself driving aimlessly through the city, replaying the confession in his head until it felt like static noise. Amelia sat silently in the passenger seat, tears sliding down her cheeks. They'd finally torn the mask off the villain, but the raw hurt still pulsed inside them like an open wound. For Eric, an unexpected wave of guilt rose to the surface. He couldn't stop thinking about all those moments he'd turned on Amelia, all the accusations he'd hurled her way. Yes, the evidence was faked and expertly presented, but he'd let his anger do the talking instead of his heart. He remembered the night he'd shoved her out of his apartment, the awful words he'd spat in her face. The memory made him grip the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Amelia, meanwhile, was dealing with the realization that she'd lost years of her life to a lie. Job opportunities had slipped away because certain key people believed she was dishonest. Friendships had crumbled under the weight of rumors. And, most painfully, she'd lost Eric, the one person she thought was meant to stand beside her. She thought about how she'd tried to move on, bury the pain, pretend it all never happened. But now the old wound was rippy. Spilled out like salt on raw flesh. They eventually parked near a deserted waterfront, the moonlight casting a silver glow on the water. For a while, they just listened to the gentle lapping of waves, neither knowing what to say. Sometimes, the truth brings closure. But sometimes it reopens wounds you thought had scarred over. Eric placed a hesitant hand on Amelia's shoulder, both of them understanding that healing wouldn't be an overnight process. They'd gotten answers, but the real challenge was learning to forgive both the betrayer and themselves. In the days that followed, Eric and Amelia realized that exposing the perpetrator didn't magically fix what was broken inside them. If anything, it highlighted how much damage had been done and how long it might take to feel whole again. They began seeing a counselor who specialized in conflict resolution and relationship repair more for closure than anything else. Their first few sessions felt awkward and forced. They'd talk in half sentences, tripping over memories and resentments. But slowly, they found their rhythm. Eric learned to own his part, admitting he let ego and suspicion drive him to push Amelia away. Amelia uncovered her own regrets, how she retreated into silence and gave up trying to prove her innocence, letting bitterness harden around her heart. The counselor encouraged them to practice open communication even when it hurt. So they faced the painful questions head-on. Why was it so easy to believe the worst in each other? Why didn't they fight for their love when accusations first surfaced? These conversations were hard, tears often cutting them short. But with every vulnerable admission, the weight on their chests lifted just a bit. Outside of therapy, Amelia tried to pick up hobbies she'd abandoned, like painting, something she used to be passionate about. Eric took long walks, reflecting on the person he wanted to be moving forward. They also spent time going through the legal steps of reporting their betrayer's actions, though the process was complex and draining. Through it all, they relied on each other as unlikely pillars of support. Even if they didn't know what their future held as a couple, they understood each other's pain more intimately than anyone else could. Bit by bit, trust flickered to life between them, fragile but growing. It turned out forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past. It was about acknowledging the wounds, then deciding to move forward together, scars and all. A few weeks later, on a quiet evening, Eric found himself standing outside the apartment he and Amelia once shared. The landlord had called, saying the unit was up for rent again. Curiosity got the better of him. The building looked the same peeling paint, same creaky stairwell, same flickering light in the hallway. But stepping inside felt like entering a time capsule. He remembered the late-night dance parties they'd have in the tiny living room, the shared cooking disasters in the cramped kitchen, and how Amelia used to sing off-key show tunes in the shower. In each room, he could almost see the ghosts of their younger selves, full of hope and oblivious to what was about to tear them apart. Eric called Amelia, hesitating before speaking. "Do you want to come see this place with me?" She paused, then said she'd be there. When she arrived, they wandered through the empty rooms in silence. Despite the echoes of good times, the walls also whispered memories of shouting matches and heartbreak. Finally, they stood by the window that overlooked the street, the spot where they once cuddled and people watched on lazy afternoons. Eric turned to Amelia and asked, "How would you feel about us trying again? Not right away, not forcing it, but seeing if we can build something new." Her eyes brimmed with emotion. She admitted she still felt raw, uncertain if she was ready to take such a big step. But something in her posture, the way she didn't bolt or shut him down, gave Eric hope. Their conversation meandered through fears, boundaries, and half-lost dreams. They left the apartment hand in hand, deciding they wouldn't jump into a lease, but they wouldn't run from the idea either. This was a tentative step back toward the home they once tried to make, acknowledging that while the past was painful, it wasn't the whole story. There was room for a new chapter, however slowly they chose to write it. From that day on, Eric and Amelia focused on rebuilding trust in the most ordinary ways possible, sharing small secrets, watching a favorite movie together, texting each other random updates about their day. It wasn't glamorous or dramatic, but it felt like progress. They agreed that honesty had to be their foundation this time. No more hiding emotions out of fear of judgment, no more assuming the worst. When Eric felt a pang of jealousy or worry, he'd tell Amelia and they'd talk it through. When Amelia felt insecure, she'd speak up instead of bottling it all in. It was awkward at first, especially since they'd grown used to dancing around the truth. But each tiny act of honesty felt like a new brick laid in the fragile structure they were building. They also committed to respecting each other's space. They both needed time to process the trauma they'd lived through. So they took slow steps, weekly dinner dates, check-ins, and the occasional weekend outing. Little by little, the tension between them eased. Their banter felt more natural, and sometimes they'd even laugh about old inside jokes without that hollow ache tagging along. Relearning each other's quirks, Amelia's newfound love for exotic teas, Eric's obsession with a certain sports podcast added fresh paint to the canvas of their relationship. Friends who knew about their ordeal watched cautiously, some still skeptical, others rooting for them to succeed. Eric and Amelia didn't try to justify their choices to anyone. They'd learned the hard way that other people's opinions only mattered so much. The real test was how they felt day to day. And day by day, they felt a little more at peace. No, they weren't healed entirely. Scars remained. But they were doing the work, supporting each other through triggers and anxieties. In that slow, steady process, they both rediscovered something they thought they'd lost. A simple, genuine joy in each other's presence, built one small, honest moment at a time. One crisp morning, they decided to revisit the park bench where Eric first ran into Amelia all those weeks ago. This time, though, the air felt lighter. The trees still rustled, and kids still chased each other around. But in Eric's mind, the bench no longer symbolized heartbreak. It felt like a touch point for a new beginning. They sat side by side, sipping on takeout coffee, soaking in the calm. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, unlike before. Eventually, Amelia reached into her bag and pulled out something that made Eric's heart lurch. The old sweater he'd given her so many years ago on that rainy night. She'd repaired a few loose threads, and though the fabric was worn, it still held a familiar warmth. "I think it's time it came full circle," she said, handing it to him with a shy smile. Eric stared at it. The soft wool, the faded logo, memories swirling in his head. A lump formed in his throat. He gently shook his head and tucked it back into her hands. "Keep it for now," he said, voice shaky. "It suits you better." In that exchange, they recognized how far they'd come. The sweater wasn't just a piece of cloth anymore. It was proof of their resilience, a reminder that something once stained by hurt could still be saved. As they strolled through the park, they shared small fantasies about the future. Trips they might take, traditions they'd love to start, and how they might handle disagreements differently this time around. Felt vulnerable, but it also felt good. That glimmer of hope sparkled in every word, every shared smile. They both knew life could still throw them curveballs. Scars don't vanish overnight, and trust needs constant nurturing. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't weighed down by suspicion or anger. They walked away from that park feeling hopeful, like maybe the worst was finally behind them. Just as they were beginning to settle into this new normal, fresh trouble knocked on their door. A late-night call from an unknown number warned that the puppet master wasn't working alone. According to the distorted voice on the line, someone else with even deeper pockets was now gunning for Amelia and Eric, determined to silence them. At first, they brushed it off as another scare tactic. But when they found suspicious footprints in Amelia's garden and a threatening note taped to Eric's car window, they had no choice but to take it seriously. Panic swelled inside them, threatening to unravel the fragile peace they'd fought so hard to build. With their guard up, they reached out to any remaining allies, hoping to confirm if another threat was indeed lurking in the shadows. The tension put their relationship to the test. Old fears resurfaced. Eric worried Amelia might run again. Amelia feared Eric would shut her out. But this time, instead of letting paranoia drive a wedge between them, they leaned on each other. They spent nights at one another's place, forging a united front. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Eric would wake to find Amelia trembling, haunted by the idea of a stranger lurking outside. He'd hold her close, whispering reassurances until she calmed. By daylight, they strategized, contacting authorities, updating restraining orders, and even considering private security. It felt surreal, like they were living in a crime drama. But as horrifying as it was, Eric noticed they were stronger together now than they ever had been before. Their communication was clear, their support for one another unwavering. In a strange way, this new threat forced them to realize they could stand against anything if they faced it side by side. The fear was real and the danger was looming. But so was their commitment to not let the darkness of the past swallow their future. Everything came to a head on a stormy evening, as if the weather itself anticipated a showdown. The source who'd tipped them off about the new threat finally agreed to meet in person at a remote cabin just outside of town. It seemed sketchy as hell, but Amelia and Eric felt cornered. Armed with determination and a quiet resolve, they made their way through winding roads and pouring rain. Upon arriving, the cabin's windows flickered with weak light, shadows dancing inside. Their contact was already there, jittery and glancing over their shoulder as if expecting an ambush. They warned Eric and Amelia that the ring of deceit went deeper than just the betrayer. Money, influence, and personal grudges had all fueled an elaborate plan to keep them apart, and that plan wasn't finished yet. Before they could get more details, headlights cut through the darkness. 3 figures appeared at the doorway, clearly not there to chat. Tension crackled. The intruders demanded whatever evidence Eric and Amelia had. Threats were thrown around, but Eric refused to hand over a thing. Adrenaline coursed through him as he shielded Amelia, determined not to lose her again. In a blur of raised voices and the flash of a weapon, chaos erupted. Someone lunged for the box of documents, Amelia tried to intervene, and a gunshot cracked through the air. For a split second, Eric's heart dropped, thinking Amelia might be hit. But thankfully, the shot went wide. The scuffle ended when one of the intruders got pinned down by their own accomplice's stumble, giving Eric and the contact a chance to subdue them. Sirens wailed in the distance. The contact had called the cops beforehand, anticipating trouble. By the time the police arrived, the rain-soaked floor of the cabin was littered with scattered pages of evidence, battered egos, and the heavy weight of what almost happened. But Eric and Amelia stood tall, battered yet victorious. They'd faced the puppet masters and won, ready to finally close the chapter on this nightmare. In the aftermath, life felt surreal. The betrayer and their accomplices faced a maze of legal repercussions: fraud, extortion, harassment. Eric and Amelia turned over every shred of evidence they had, determined to bring full justice for themselves and anyone else manipulated in the elaborate scheme. The news coverage painted a picture of high-stakes drama, but for Eric and Amelia, it was finally an exhale after years of gasping for air. Slowly, they began rebuilding what the lies had stolen. Amelia's reputation improved as the true story came to light. She found new opportunities in her field, her name finally cleared of past slander. Eric pursued a better job, putting the bitterness of old workplace gossip behind him. They celebrated small victories, Amelia landing a big project, Eric acing a crucial interview, each event more meaningful because they'd fought so hard to get there. Among the many tasks, one of the hardest was learning to truly forgive themselves. Eric wrestled with the guilt of pushing Amelia away, while Amelia grappled with her own regrets for not standing her ground. Counseling sessions became less about raw pain and more about growth. They talked openly about fears and dreams in a way they never had before. Each day, trust felt a little less fragile, and the memories of anguish gave way to a deeper, more mature bond. The love that had once been shattered found a chance to breathe again, but it looked different now, wiser, tempered by the heat of trials they'd endured. They visited the park bench, the apartment, and other places that once held them captive in memories. This time, they walked away feeling relief instead of regret. Where there was pain, there was now a sense of closure. Where there was betrayal, there was the promise of a fresh start. Redemption doesn't come easy or fast, but in the end, Eric and Amelia discovered it was worth every ounce of effort. Morning light filtered through the living room blinds of their newly shared space, a modest apartment that felt more like home each day. Boxes still needed unpacking, pictures waited to be hung, and routines were a work in progress. But Eric and Amelia had never been happier. As they sipped coffee, Eric leaned against the kitchen counter and asked, "Remember when we thought we'd never speak again?" Amelia gave a soft laugh. "Hard to believe how far we've come." They still had flashes of old hurt, moments where trust wobbled. But they'd built a robust safety net of open communication and honest effort. Whenever doubt reared its head, one of them would say, "Hey, can we talk?" That simple question became a lifeline, a reminder that they were in this together. They'd also made peace with the truth that healing is an ongoing process. Some days would be hard, filled with triggers and flashbacks. But every time they overcame a challenge, it felt like a small victory that strengthened their bond. Friends and family gathered for a little housewarming get-together, noticing the genuine warmth between them. Gone was the tension that once clouded every interaction. Now they radiated a calm sort of unity earned through struggle and perseverance. After the guests left, they found themselves cuddled on the couch, reminiscing about their journey from the park bench reunion to unraveling the scheme, from shattered accusations to forging a brand new love. In the soft glow of a table lamp, Amelia smiled. "I'm not saying we've got everything figured out, but I'm glad we didn't give up." Eric squeezed her hand, pulling her closer. Tomorrow might bring challenges, big or small, but for now they had hope. They had each other. And in that moment, as rain tapped lightly on the window, an echo of the past, they both understood that this wasn't the end of their story. It was a fresh beginning, a life they'd build one honest day at a time.